gentlemen, for making it on time. I know it's a rainy evening and it's a working day, but I guess just looking at the full room, it just speaks of the interest about, everyone wants to learn about Ashish's journey, the topic. And, this is a very rare and special occasion for us to have this opportunity to sort of host someone of Ashish's caliber, stature, and, given everything that he's achieved and continues to do on various fronts. As I sort of begin, quick introductions. I'm Prantik. I'm the president of TIE Singapore. Many of you are TIE members. Many of you are new to TIE or becoming part of TIE. In quick sort of description, TIE happens to be one of the largest network of entrepreneurs and investors globally. And our role is to, be a catalyst in an entrepreneur's journey. And, we've been around for about 33 years, 24 years in Singapore, and the organization is going from strength to strength. We have, we're sort of we are in 66 cities right now. We have over 15,000 members. And thanks to the network, we're sort of able to convene interesting sessions, meaningful conversations like the one we're going to have this evening. Quick vote of thanks, first and foremost, to Anita from Ashoka University. Anita, thank you. That quick call, probably 3 weeks ago, led to getting all of this organized. I also want to thank one of our charter members from UBS, Akshay, who made the introduction and the connection, and that's the power of the network, right? People get to know what's happening, who's coming, and that allows us to bring, interesting speakers and guests to Singapore. All right, about today's session, I think, as you would have received in the invite, we're going to be talking about the very interesting transition and journey of Ashish from private equity to philanthropic equity. Now, look, Ashish's introduction, he's had a stellar career in various domains. And, if I start with a formal introduction, that'll take me 15 minutes. But I think the man needs no introduction. If you've heard of institutional names such as Chris Capital, Ashoka University, CSF, the Convergence Foundation, the man behind all of those institutions is Ashish Dhawan. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for my guest tonight, Ashish Dhawan. Ashish, welcome to Singapore. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us.
Thank you, Prantik.
Thank you so much. He's had a long couple of days. He's met the president, and that makes it even more special that we have the opportunity to host him for a closed-door session like this. Ashish, people have shared a lot of questions with me, but I'm going to start with the topic in terms of the transition, right? These are two very interesting but different worlds: private equity, philanthropic equity. Question for you is, what led to that transition? What triggered that? Was there one moment? And would be great to understand, because in TIE we have a lot of people from private equity, a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of VCs, and many of them probably have their philanthropic pursuits in parallel. But you made a very clear transition. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think there were several influences. It wasn't like a knee-jerk reaction. Growing up, my maternal grandfather, he'd grown up in Lahore. He actually developed a passion for education, and particularly for Madame Montessori and the Montessori method. So he set up the first Montessori school called the Lahore Montessori School, and then a second one, and then the partition happened and he moved to Delhi, and then he got into business and was in real estate. But because his passion was education, he couldn't call it the Lahore Montessori School, he called it the La Montessori School, and set up about 50 schools across NCR, right, more focused on lower middle income. So his idea with the schools was always he'll put up the upfront capital, they should break even, and he'll make money elsewhere. So I saw that firsthand. I used to visit those schools when I was a young boy and was quite influenced by that and the power of education. And then later, when I was in my 20s, I read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, and that had a big impact on me, because he was a guy who ran a printing press in Philadelphia, and at age 43 left that commercial enterprise, and that's when he was able to do lots of interesting things. I mean, nobody else can do that, but still, I mean, it's the fact that he had a second career, a third career, had to reinvent himself. That idea seemed interesting. So I decided to be an entrepreneur at age 30 when I set up Chris Capital, and I had it in the back of my head that somewhere in my 40s I should make the transition. I didn't know exactly what. I thought naively at one point that maybe it'll be into politics. When I moved back to India and set up Chris Capital, I said, no, that's not for me. But I can definitely work from the outside on some aspect of social change. So that was always there. And then I think if an idea stays in your head, you start planning for it. So as I built, first 7, 8, 9 years of investing in private equity, I don't think I thought too much about it. After that, once we had a track record, a team that was stable, we got to a certain stage, I said, now's the time for me to take 5% of my time and start to learn. So I got onto the board of a think tank called Center for Civil Society. I knew this guy called Pacha in Delhi, who's a libertarian, and Gurcharan Das was on the board, and a bunch of other people. So it was a way to learn about public policy and education reform. I got onto the board of Akanksha, Teach for India. I knew Shaheen Mistry in Bombay, and she's a force for nature, very entrepreneurial, etc. So I said, she's a friend, there's an opportunity for me to learn. And then I was giving money to a couple of non-profits, like, in India, and so that gave me an opportunity to go on a Saturday and see what they were doing. Started to read a bit more about it, and that gave me the courage to finally say in 2010, I was on holiday, I remember, and I said, now I've got to raise another fund in another year and a half. So that's that critical decision you've got to make. Are you in or not? And that was going to be our 6th fund. And I said, no, I don't want to be part of it. So I have a year and a half. Let me go and tell all our investors that I was a key man. There was a real risk that we would fold up. So I said, let me go warn people in advance and get everything ready. By then, we had a very solid team. So I was confident the firm would persevere and persist and live on. But convincing others was going to be the next task. So I did that over a year and a half, and then finally transitioned in about 13 and a half years ago.
Wow, so clearly the seeds will probably sown
way back,
but a pretty deliberate transition that you had to sort of plan for. From the outside, the two worlds seem so different. But do you see any parallels, any similarities in the world of private equity and philanthropic equity?
I think so. I think that, whether it's private equity or business or anything, it teaches you how to think strategically. In investing, at least, you learn to be quite skeptical also. You see hundreds of different things and you have to say no, and at the end of the day, you're going to get measured by your returns. So you're pretty hard-nosed in terms of your decision-making, and you have to be a doubting Thomas all the time, right? So I think that's good. It's a healthy trait. You're very focused on results. IRR matters, and because you live and die by that, because you can do any amount of marketing, but if your returns are poor, nobody's going to give you money. And it's a lot about stakeholder management as well. You got to manage. We had LPs all over the world, globally. One of the first to have LPs from Japan to the US, to the Middle East, and sovereign funds, etc. So manage, and then, figuring out how to incentivize a team and build a good team and transition and all. So I think there's a lot of things you learn from the world of business. And when I switched over to the philanthropic world, I'd say probably 80% of that was useful. 20% I had to unlearn and then learn new stuff. The milieu, the context is very different. So being too corporate-like is a big disservice, I think. Firstly, I think, I'm not talking so much about Ashoka even, but in anything that's philanthropic, your timelines need to be a little longer. Solving social problems are very complex. Like take school education. You want to turn the needle, you've got to be patient. Just the process indicators take 3 to 5 years to move, and it possibly takes 5 to 10 years to see outcome indicators at scale if you're working with the public system. So what I find when corporate people come in, they come in all guns blazing with too many of their own ideas, and they're not willing to listen enough. And I think this world requires you to be a better listener, be a little bit more patient, to learn to work with people who are not motivated by money. They're very mission-oriented, so I think you have to recruit the right set of people, and also when you manage people, it's very different because the motivation is they're not there for the money, they're there for the purpose. And so keeping people tethered to that is very, very critical. So there's a bunch of new things you need to learn. And there was some fear, I would say, because I had done reasonably well in investing, making the transition, that was I just going to fail? Was I going to become irrelevant, and my skill sets would get rusty? Honestly, my parents were more worried about that than me.
Even at that age?
Yeah, they thought I was 43 and I was going to retire. And your mom and dad, they worry I'll be like a bum watching TV all day long, watching Netflix, I love beer, I'll be drinking beer every night, that kind of thing. But that's not the way it turned out.
You spoke about ideas and unlearning, relearning. Did that shift your thinking in terms of ideologies? Do you still believe in capitalism?
I do. I'm a big believer in markets and in capitalism. I think, although now that I'm on the other side, I also do see market failures. Markets don't work. I also appreciate the role of the state much more. Honestly, when I was in the business world, I abhorred government. I didn't want to meet a single bureaucrat. I just wanted to stay away from sarkari offices. I thought they were a pain in the ass. And it was only downside, because if you met an IAS officer, they always would talk about their son or daughter and how they wanted a private equity job. And then, it became embarrassing to say no, to interview the person, say no. So I really stayed away from them. And I thought these people are useless. They just throw sand in the wheels. They just create uncertainty. And that's often true in India, that it's an overbearing, over-regulated state. But now on the other side, I also see the power of the state in terms of being a facilitator, a coordinator. Laissez-faire capitalism doesn't completely work. I think you need, and you've seen it in East Asia, you need a state that provides stability, that provides the ability to facilitate, coordinate, sometimes gives you the right incentives to get an industry going, getting up the learning curve. All of those kinds of things. Singapore is a great example of that. Creating the basic infrastructure as well, the human capital, through the schooling system. So I've come to appreciate the role of the state, despite the state, of course, being much weaker in India than in East Asia. But how important it is to work with the system and improve the system, and being patient about that, because I realize there's no getting around it. If you want to impact school education at scale, you can't do it by building 5 schools on your own. You have to work with the public system. There's no way around it. And then also, I think I didn't maybe appreciate the role of civil society as much, that Samaj part. And I think civil society in India is very dynamic. There's lots of amazing people in the social sector who do grassroots work, who drive change, who are all heart. The challenge they have often is they are not able to systematize their work or scale it or even find a way to embed it in the system. They don't know how to work with government per se. They can sign some MOU to get access to work in 5 health facilities or 10 schools. But how do you take your pilot and the evidence and then embed it, advocate for it, get budgets unlocked, work on policy? They're not able to do that. But there's a lot to learn from what they do at the grassroots level. So I've come to appreciate the role of Bazaar, Sarkar, Samaj much more as being 3 actors, 3 legs of the stool, whereas in the corporate world, I really was much more focused only on markets and not on the other 2.
Yeah. And talking about education reforms, you set up CSF, Ashoka University a decade plus ago. Just give us a glimpse of, and of course in that same decade, India has gone through a lot of political change as well. In that sort of, that backdrop, what's been the change in the education sector in India? What would you count as the biggest impact of CSF and Ashoka University as far as education reform is concerned?
Yeah, I'll start with CSF and maybe go to Ashoka. So CSF is Central Square Foundation. We set it up about 13 years ago. Honestly, bumbled around for 6-7 years. Bumbled around is in, not that we didn't do anything. We worked with about 14 state governments on what I call point solutions. So I had this view that we want the demand to be there. So Andhra Pradesh would say we're interested in education technology, we'd work with them. Madhya Pradesh said we're interested in building headmaster capacity. We said that's a great idea, we'll work on doing that. Some other state came and said we're interested in assessment reform, we'd work with them on that. Because I believe that demand pull was important, because then they would take it forward. So we did that for many years, learned a lot. But honestly, when we look back after, and at that point I hadn't taken any outside money, it was all my own capital, I said the impact is zero. I could call a spade, and because it was a set of point solutions, it didn't add up. And so then we decided to focus only on foundational literacy and numeracy. And we started to become more strategic. We said, listen, this should have been obvious to us. You know, in India, learning breaks down early. Third grade is that critical grade when children switch from learning to read to reading to learn, because the curriculum then moves on. And ASAR data, NAS data, which is the government's data, shows you very starkly that more than half the kids fall behind, and then they fall behind permanently because your learning trajectory starts to plateau then, if you don't have the basic foundational skills. And we said, let's focus on this, let's work systemically, let's do some pilots at district level. A method called structured pedagogy had worked in places that go from poor to fair. So learning from Singapore is a bad idea. Learning from Finland is a bad idea. Those are countries that have gone from good to great in the recent past. So context matters a lot. So we learned from that, and then went to 3 states, Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, convinced the chief ministers to launch missions focused on Bunyadi Shiksha, and decided to work in grades 1, 2, and 3. They unlocked budgets because the CMs were behind it. It was mission mode. And then ultimately the new education policy was being drafted, so got in front of Dr. Kasuri Rangan. And then fortunately Manjur Bhargav was writing the NEP, and we got to know him well, and so worked on that. And the NEP clearly called out that foundational literacy and numeracy should be the #1 priority in education, should be put into mission mode, et cetera, et cetera. So we worked a lot on the policy. And then the Prime Minister announced a national mission a year and a half later called Nipun Bharat. About 13,000 crore in Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan budget was unlocked towards teaching learning material that any state could pull on. So that then was prime time. So we said instead of working with 3 states, we expanded to 10 states, only to work on implementation of the Nipun Bharat mission. To do that, we set up a project management unit inside the education department with 5 work streams, very sharply focused, 14 KPIs. This is where corporate training helps. Working alongside the academic body on the technical side in terms of the teaching learning material, teacher guides, workbooks, math kits, all of that. All of the cost is paid for by government, the printing cost, because the central government now has the budget. And then building the data systems, the tools, the apps, like an observation app for the coaches, the data, and giving it to the government as a public good. So we have done that now in 10 states, and there are others as well. We seeded an org called Learning Language Foundation, set up by an IAS officer who has a PhD in education. So Dheer Jingran, he also works in some states. We helped seed an org called Madhi, a woman called Merlia, who's based in Chennai, who's done a great job in Tamil Nadu, and now she's expanding to Andhra. So we wanted to create an ecosystem of orgs working on this, but working systemically. So saying we're not going to run our own program, we'll only work with the government and work at state level and at district level. So now we're finally seeing results where if you look at the ASAR data or NAS data, for the first time, this foundational learning data which had flatlined, you're seeing an uptick in learning levels. So I think that for me is very gratifying because it's not impact in one district or in one village, but it's impact. In Uttar Pradesh, over these last 7-8 years, 7% of kids would attain literacy by 3rd grade. Now it's 28%. You'd say 28% is too low, but it's a 4x. And this is ASAR data, third party. The government's own NAS data is slightly better in terms of, you could argue which one is right, but either which way, huge improvement. So I think that shows to us that working systemically, you can, it takes time, but you can drive change. And government is willing to engage with outside partners. There's no doubt. And advocacy, while it takes time, is huge ROI, because you can unlock government. Government spends almost $100 billion a year on education. So it's not like we spend almost 3% of our GDP, 2.8% of our GDP on education. The state does. Private sector spends another 3% of GDP on education. So it's not like we don't spend money. It's just that we're far away from the efficient frontier in terms of getting efficiency and effectiveness for that spend. So that's the CSF journey. Ashoka is very different in that we're an independent institution. Really, the idea was to focus on building a university that's a little bit different from the traditional British model of the university in India, which puts students in a straitjacket where you study one subject. So Ashoka is more like an American university which offers more breadth and depth, more interdisciplinary and holistic learning, more of a Socratic method, etc. And it was a new experiment in that sense. And Srinath Raghavan, who's here, is one of our senior faculty members, leads the IR department. Actually built the international relations department at Ashoka. And Venkat, who's here, is our pro vice chancellor, and Anita. So Ashoka was, the idea was not that we're going to build 100 university. The idea was if we can create a new institution, private, built with the model of collective philanthropy, partnering with academics who are top class, and with this different sort of idea of what a university should look like, maybe we can become a sort of bellwether for education reform in India, in that other new institutions will come up on the Ashoka type model, and that eventually even some of our public institutions will move to become more interdisciplinary and holistic. And if you look at the NEP 2020, it talks about by 2040, all higher ed institutions should move to becoming more multidisciplinary, holistic, etc., including the IITs. So I think for us, I mean, obviously we're only 3,200 students. We need to get to almost 3x that in the next 15 years and raise the bar for excellence in research and teaching. But I think the bigger impact will really be if the ingredients of the Ashoka model can spread to other institutions, or we become a model for others. Because Indian higher ed already has 44 million students. In 15 years, it will probably have 60 million students. So one institution with, whether it's 8,000, 10,000 students, yeah, we can educate future leaders for the country. We can produce PhDs who will go to other institutions, some research that's hopefully relevant. But the bigger impact, I think, will be the same way I think the IITs, the alumni are great, but a big impact of the IITs was to make, the early IITs was to make engineering prestigious. And therefore you eventually had 5,000 engineering colleges, 1 million plus engineering graduates, etc. And the IIMs did the same for management education. Can Ashoka do that with the idea of a sort of holistic and multidisciplinary education?
Fascinating. Two very distinct experiments that started about a decade plus, and clearly we're sort of seeing the fruits. But two questions, right? I mean, you spoke about 3% of GDP being spent on education, but on the other side, if you look, clearly this is a mammoth problem in a country like India, but nearly 80 years of being independent, so much money being spent forth in terms of GDP, yet we're nowhere close to 100% literacy. Now, no doubt, this is a huge mammoth task. You've got to coordinate with so many states. Two parts of the question: what are the big challenges and what will accelerate this? If we have to become a 100% literate country, what needs to give, what needs to be done?
Yeah, so firstly, I think we didn't prioritize, primary schooling or foundational literacy as a country. We built temples of excellence in terms of a few good higher ed institutions, but we at the time of independence and for many decades thereafter, unlike countries like Vietnam and China, which were communist, which really focused on education for all, and so built a very, very strong primary schooling system, India didn't do that. It doesn't mean it's too late. I think we can do it now. So I think as a consequence, a few things have happened. One is private schooling is much bigger in India. Nothing wrong with that, but you have to accept it. So there's two systems. There's the government system and then private schools, where almost 49% of kids in India, so out of the 250 plus million children in India who go to school, almost half go to either an unaided school or a government-aided private school, right? The vast majority to unaided private schools, and then the other half in the government system. I think the good news now is that, firstly, also, if you look at it, for a politician, they want to get results in 5 years. And the downside with education, it's a slow-moving indicator. It takes a long time. Unlike, doing 24/7 electricity, you just need to string the wires and build the transmission lines and, the power generation, all that. I think education is a much more complex production function, because it's ultimately, you need behavior change of the teachers, right? If the classroom transaction doesn't change, nothing's going to change. You can have a bunch of accountability measures and governance and all, nothing's going to change. So it's a very complex production function, and it's not easy to change, and it's long lead time indicator. And therefore, politically, it's not been one that, so I would give a lot of credit to the AAP government, at least, that they made education politically salient, and they hung their hat on education reform in a way, saying, "Humne ye kiya hai with Delhi." Delhi schools there are only 1,100 Delhi government schools. They're larger, but they did make a big. It was a big focus for the government. So I think, as a consequence, and now that we're also done with some of the other basic sort of enablers for the poor, welfareism, we've done a reasonably good job in the last 10 years in getting, whether it's DBT to people or basic electricity, toilets, all of that stuff. I think the next leg of basic services will be impacting education and health, both of which we haven't made as much improvement. Or nutrition, like if you look at measures like stunting and wasting, India still does quite poorly. So I have a feeling that the governments now will prioritize this over the next 10 years, because some of the basics are done, and we should see better results going forward as a result of that.
You made a couple of points about the experiment of the Ashoka University as a lighthouse project. Many others hopefully will emulate. You spoke about the IITs sort of making engineering prestigious. Just connecting those dots, we're sort of seeing in today's world, a lot of people are questioning the correlation between good education necessarily leading to good jobs. That's happening in Singapore, in the US, India for sure. What's your take? I mean, clearly you've been trying to reform education, but if, let's say, I'm a beneficiary of that, but that doesn't lead to a formal employment, do we need to look at a different form of education? Does the policies need to adapt to a different world that we're operating in? How is that going to shape education reform in a country like India?
Yeah, I think, look, there is a very strong correlation between it, and it works both ways, by the way. So you don't know, the causality is both ways, between human capital and economic growth, or, so there's no denying it that better human capital leads to better economic growth, and better economic growth, or the demand side, also pulls up the supply side. So I think in a country like India, I can't comment on Singapore, where levels are quite low, I think it's a no-brainer to improve education outcomes, because we are shutting out half our population from, if they can't read, write, and do basic math, you're shutting out half the people, or, and there may be some other barriers beyond education. Like, for instance, women in the workforce, women are as educated as men. In fact, the GER for women now is higher than it crossed the male GER, gross enrollment ratio, in college in 2018. And now it's a percentage and a half point higher. And yet, women's labor force participation is quite low. Women's participation in the formal sector is only 18%. So there are some structural barriers there and other things. So it's not like education is the panacea and the only thing, but I think it's absolutely critical in India, and it's the rising tide that can lift all boats. If your question is more about AI and the impact of that and stuff like that, firstly, I think in India, our labor force participation is still quite low. And most jobs are fairly basic jobs. And while AI will have an impact, I think on a lot of basic jobs, it'll be AI plus whatever you're doing, as opposed to displacement. So I think getting our workforce to be more AI literate. So in fact, the thing we're working on now at CSF is a project called AI Samarth. We partnered with Google, and we brought in IIT Chennai. There's a professor there, Professor Ravindran, who runs the School of AI. And we just developed an AI curriculum for high school, for teachers in middle and high school, and for students, which 3 state governments are picking up. And ultimately, once the pilot works well, we want the Prime Minister to launch it as a... So I think getting our students to be AI literate, you've got to lean into this, is very, very important.
And clearly seems like you're orchestrating this as a public-private partnership.
Yeah, so I think government realizes that this is new, and they want external people to actually develop. It has to be vetted by them. I mean,
Sure.
You can't develop a curriculum and take it into schools unless it's vetted by government. But they want, and that's why we partnered with IIT Madras, because they have credibility as a government institution. As CSF as a non-profit org, just doing it would not have been sufficient. So the fact that we can say we've got IIT Madras and they've worked with us on this, and then the fact that we get some state governments to pilot it and show results, so then we can hopefully go in. We've gone and shown it to Dharmendra Pradhan, and but we're not ready for prime time as yet. I think we'll have to pilot it, see how it works. It's not going to be easy. Again, training teachers has always been difficult. Getting the older ones, especially the younger ones, I'm sure, the ones in their 20s and early 30s, probably are already somewhat AI literate, and getting them there will be easier. For the older ones, it'll be much harder. And in fact, when we did a survey of teachers, their biggest fear, and the reason they're sort of, is that their kids, the students, are way ahead of them in technology and AI. So there's a fear almost of this. So getting them, but at the same time, there's a demand in a way. They want to be AI literate because they feel they've been left behind. So, but we'll see how it goes. It's early days.
Looking ahead, the Prime Minister has laid out the vision of, Viksit Bharat, wanting India to be a developed nation in the next 22 years. What's your take? What does developed India look like beyond the GDP metrics, the per capita metric, from I guess, 2 parts of the question. One, in terms of education, what does a developed India look like for you? What would be satisfactory? And the other is, beyond education, are there 2 or 3 other structural reforms that you would like the government to pave the path for?
So I'll start with the structural reforms, and then I'll come to what does it mean. So I think that, in 91, when we made a set of critical reforms, they were great because it opened India up to the world. License Raj went away, and we've had reasonably good monetary and fiscal stability. India is one of the few countries that hasn't defaulted on her sovereign paper as an emerging market, unlike many other EMs that have been extremely volatile. So we have to give a lot of credit to what was done. And it also unleashed private enterprise. But if you look at it, we really have not had significant structural transformation over the last couple of decades. I mean, even today, 45% of our workforce is in agriculture. And this is when labor force participation rates are low, because female labor force participation is still at 40%, according to the latest PLFS data, I think 42%, but male participation is almost 80%. So on a blended basis, it's like 60-ish%, right? It should be higher. It should be in the 70+%. So we just haven't created enough jobs, basically, and we haven't seen structural transformation off the farm into manufacturing and into services. So I think the big reforms now are We've done the opening up. In India, the people who follow markets and all always care about fiscal policy and monetary policy. I completely ignore that. I think India does a pretty good job. I think the next set of reforms are more factor market reforms. So while the license Raj went away, the inspector Raj didn't go away. Your ease of doing, it's a dis-ease of doing business, a disease of doing business, in India. It's, to open a restaurant, you need 80, there's some 80 licenses and approvals, and there's no single window. As they say, a single window opens and leads to many doors. So there's tax terrorism, when that some guy will open a case on you and when there's no merit to it. So I think doesn't create an attractive investment climate. And while the larger companies can manage this, larger Indian companies, because they'll have their people who can navigate all this. But it means that SMEs have not been able to thrive as a result of this. So, you have lots of dwarfs in the Indian corporate sector. So we have some 65, 70 million MSMEs, micro and small, medium enterprises. But if you look at the number of SMEs, it's only 530,000. And the average, and those are companies from 1 crore to about 500 crore turnover. And the average SME, not MSME, employs 60 people. So there are 31 million employees in these 530,000 enterprises. And the average turnover is only 5 crore, less than $1 million, So this sector really has not, for a large country like India, it's shocking that that's the state of your SME sector. So I think one reform is massive deregulation. Second is a huge booster shock to SMEs. Most countries have very good credit guarantee schemes, interest rate subvention, improved market access, support for SMEs. And with maybe the M part also, the micro part, but not the nano enterprise, the woman making agarbatti at home, or the guy with a push cart selling amrud or whatever, guavas on the roadside, can't scale their business. That's a one-person enterprise. But finding the enterprises that can scale from 10 jobs to 100 jobs, or 50 jobs to 500 jobs, and giving them that injection is very critical, both in terms of cheaper cost of capital, easy access to capital, maybe even thinking through some subsidization of equity capital. So India hasn't done that, because all the people who lobby for incentives are big business. Small business has no voice, as it were. So I think apart from deregulation, I think a second is a strong focus on the SME sector. And particularly that slice, I think we should leave out the nano. India always goes after the nano. How do I take the SHG group women, and this is a good thing, I'm not saying it's bad, and make them Lakpati Didis. That's good, but this is not going to create your next 50 million, 100 million jobs, is my own view. So let's work with the people who are already proven. Let's give them the booster shock to do 5x in terms of growth. So that's second. Third is, I would say, manufacturing, which is, India has only 3% of global manufacturing share in labor intensive. In terms of total goods trade, we only have 1.8% global market share. So, and labor intensive, we should have had much higher market share, because our biggest endowment is labor, and it's cheap relative to China even. So again, we've not prioritized labor intensive sectors because labor laws were not easy to navigate. And also there's no votary for labor intensive. Mr. Ambani is in capital intensive businesses, Adani is in infrastructure, even the Birlas, Bajaj, their auto business today employs fewer people than 30 years ago because of automation. So, the labor intensive sectors like footwear, garments, toys, sporting goods, electronics assembly now has come to India. There's again been no voice for these labor intensive sectors. So we need the right policies for labor intensive sectors. to have them. And even if you look at PLI, which is a production-linked incentive in India, most of the PLI actually covers capital-intensive sectors and not. And I'm not saying that's wrong. We need certain sectors to come to India for strategic autonomy, right? We need certain sectors where you want India to do well. So strategic autonomy may be like the semiconductor sector or whatever. You other sectors which are already doing well, like pharma and auto, you need PLI. I'm all for it because you've got some core competence there. Let's move up the value chain. Let's build on it. Nothing wrong with it. But you're not going to create jobs there. Which semiconductor fab employs lots of people? Which auto factory actually employs lots of people? It's all automated today. But the jobs are really in manufacturing and in these labor-intensive sectors. So our incentives are not aligned there. So policy making really needs to recognize that if you want job-intensive growth, India has grown 6.5% last decade, but there's been no structural transformation. We're stuck at 45% of the workforce on the farm. So third would be huge priority around labor-intensive manufacturing and particularly labor-intensive manufacturing exports, because the world market is still much larger than the Indian market. And of course, tariffs and all need to sort themselves out if that were to happen. So I would say these are three. In terms of Viksit Bharat and getting GDP, firstly, I think higher GDP per capita is a great thing because the correlation between HDI, Human Development Index, and higher per capita income from very low levels, still about $40,000 PPP, which is about $15,000 in otherwise regular currency terms. The correlation is 90+%. And you should read, there's a paper by Land Pritchett looking at the data across 40 countries, and it's a very tight correlation, basically. So economic, and it's obvious. Obviously, if you're richer, you can spend more money to achieve outcomes for your people in terms of well-being. So I would say economic growth in and of itself should be a key objective per capita. Economic growth, because it's a rising tide that will lift all boats. That's one. But two is, it should be labor-intensive or job-creating economic growth. Like Odisha had a model where they had some economic growth, but all dribbled on the back of metals and mining and minerals and all that, right? Yeah. And some downstream industry from there. Someone set up an aluminum plant because bauxite was there. Hardly any jobs, right? So look at all the Odiyas. They all have to go outside Odisha to get jobs. And the chief minister did a good job in terms of basic services, decent job, but no real labor-intensive growth. So I think I look at Viksit Bharat or whatever this next 20 years has to be about job-intensive growth. You got to create more. Jobs is what gives people there so much of your identity, well-being for your family. Your productive citizen comes from that, and more formal sector jobs as well. So I think that is important. And then, of course, that every citizen should be able to realize their full potential, which means you need that basic education, basic access to healthcare. All of those are extremely critical. And you remove any structural barriers that prevent, whether it's women from, as Mao said, women hold up half the sky. There's no reason why women's labor force participation shouldn't be the same as that of men, 22 years from now. So those things are very important.
I have 2-3 more questions, and I'll open it up to the floor. One of the things, the criticisms of the plan is how do you also ensure that the growth is equitable? In fact, I think this morning there was a wonderful piece from Mr. Subbarao in Financial Times talking about one is the gender aspect of it. The other is also South India versus North India. There's a whole debate where southern Indian states are calling for population growth because policies or the income that they're getting from the central purse is reducing. So compared to the Bimaru states of the north versus the southern states, how do you sort of see, because even per capita PPP, it is still an average figure. So what's your viewpoint on how do we make this growth inclusive and equitable?
So firstly, distribution has its limits, right? So already, of course, Tamil Nadu contributes more to the exchequer than it gets. And Bihar is the opposite, right? But Bihar's per capita income is only diverged from that of Tamil Nadu to the extent that now it's like a fifth or a sixth of that of Tamil Nadu. So if you ask me, I think the single biggest thing we can do to have more equitable growth is that every chief minister needs to be pro-growth oriented. So in my mind, only half the states in India look at growing the pie, right? And obviously the southern, a couple of the western states, Haryana, because of NCR, does a pretty good job. Now UP has woken up, finally, because there's stability, law and order is good, but they're finally trying to attract investment. When was the last time Bihar tried to attract investment? Who's ever wanted to? The Northeast, or even if you look at like Bengal, I grew up in Calcutta, since the Singur thing, no industry wants to go to Bengal. And how are you going to create jobs if you shun industry? So I think about half of India is economically dark today, in that their growth, it's changing a bit. I see a change in like Madhya Pradesh, but we need these people to understand that growing the pie is the best way to actually create prosperity. Distributing the pie has its limits because if the pie doesn't grow, So I think we need that change in northern India and in eastern India, where the leaders really become more pro-growth oriented. They need to go out there the way Tamil Nadu does to attract investment, to create the right enabling conditions in their state, to develop their workforce, etc. I think that is the surest way to get there in terms of creating better prosperity for all. And you need to learn from the states that are doing better. So UP, for instance, I wrote a note on, because investment promotion agency in a state plays a big role in, if it's EDB played that role in Singapore, right? And Tamil Nadu has the best one in the country called Guidance. And it's not only they put a good IAS officer to lead it, but it has about 80 to 100 people. They have sectoral expertise. They do their homework. So when they go to Taiwan, it's not just a boondoggle for the chief minister or the minister, but they've seriously done their work. They know whom to go meet. They know what package will work. They've seen why that person has gone to Vietnam, what could be attractive. So it's got some technical competence, and it's not just an attraction agency, but it's a concierge service. Later if you have a problem, they'll help you resolve it. So we went, for Uttar Pradesh, I wrote a note on, because we studied the investment promotion state and said, listen, this is a huge ROI for you. You need to really be even bigger than Tamil Nadu because you're so backward today. And the good thing is it got to the chief minister because I went to Avasthi, who's his advisor, and CM then appointed this guy, Vijay Kiran, who used to be in education and then was a Kumbh Mela Adhikari. He's a very dynamic, I worked with him for 4 years in school education. He's the guy who drove that 7% to 28%. He's now become the head of Invest UP, and they're redoing the whole investment promotion agency. But it's not just that one thing. In UP, the deregulation mission that this center, it's the fastest state to make changes to labor law. We have an org that we helped incubate that just rewrote the building code in UP. They have doubled the FSI for hotels because they realized land price is too high. They couldn't attract 3-star hotels. So the pace at which they're moving, and that's what these states really need to do, is they need to learn from what a Telangana has done, or Tamil Nadu has done, or Gujarat has done, and copy that. And that will be, or Vietnam has done. And that's the best way for us to have more equitable growth across India.
Well said. No, in Singapore, over the last few years, we're seeing that. I think every year we've had investment promotion agencies from Orissa, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh sort of come and pitch. You spoke about job creation or the intensity being, sort of focusing on growth that creates jobs. The other sort of criticism is we have so much talent, but it has hardly ever translated to R&D or intellectual property creation, and I'm not sure how long does the services party last, because there'll always be a cheaper market offering that same service. How do we sort of address that?
Yeah, so look, India's R&D to GDP is about 0.65%, out of which private sector is only 0.25%. So all of corporate India, the aggregate R&D is $10 billion. Huawei spends $25 billion on R&D, right? One company. So it's abysmally low. And then if you look at the government, which spends more, because it spends 0.4%, almost double what the private sector spends, close to 20 billion, just a little less. There you've got the disease of doing science. You know, it's like really hard. When they give money, the procurement norms, the PhD salaries get paid late in public institutions and blah, blah, blah. In fact, we set up a foundation called the Foundation for Advancement of Science at Tech, which works on science and R&D policy, and we're working with the government on this ANRF and RDIF, these new vehicles. So I think a few things. One is, I would say, all is not lost again. That if you look at most countries, their R&D journey starts at about $3,000 per capita, if it's going to start. And really, because you start to feel the effects of a lack of R&D when you get to $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 per capita. That's when you fall into middle income trap, because you're not able to then punch through. And if you can't innovate, you can't move up the value chain. You can't build an economy, you know, just giving massages to people or doing low-end work, right? You really have to start building your own products and become a product nation and move ahead. So China did that starting 2000, and from 2000 to 2020, corporate R&D in China went up 100x, right? But prior to 2000, you know, you didn't hear of Huawei and these companies, they were just being born in Shenzhen and other places. Like a DJI didn't exist, BYD, you know, all of that. So it's really, India's journey, I think, starts now. And the other thing is, for corporate R&D to succeed, you need tariff balls to come down. Indian business people have been too comfortable making supernormal profits behind high barriers. And the minute you need to start competing with global products or take your own product outside is when R&D becomes critical. You know, you can't sell a Mahindra vehicle in India, or Bajaj Chetak you could sell in the old days with a long waiting line. But today Bajaj actually has 1,400 people in R&D, because they need to sell their product in Nigeria and compete with the Chinese and in Latin America, you know. So I think becoming more export-oriented, lowering your own barriers when, you know, foreign product can be sold in India and compete with you, forces you to innovate. And as the world changes faster, you will have to innovate, you know. Because like as this transition from ICE to EV, if you don't invest in R&D, you're going to be left behind completely. And all of corporate R&D is like globally is 1.7 trillion. But what's interesting, 85% of it is in 10 sectors. 70% is in 5 sectors. And India had a very low presence in those sectors. So like electronics is a major sector, semiconductor is a major sector, biotech is a major sector. India may be in generic form, it's not in biotech, right? So India has some presence in auto, some presence in chemicals. They're all manufacturing-oriented sectors where R&D. So I think the fact that now we are starting to get the manufacturing to India, then only can you start to move up the value chain. People criticize like a Dixon's, which is an assembly company, but till Dixon's doesn't start assembly and then it'll move to doing components, and then after it does components, then it can start to move up the value chain, you know. So I think that journey in some sectors has just started. In other sectors, like pharma, where you're doing a lot of D, you'll start to, now that generics is done, you've got to start punching into doing R. And you've seen Glenmark, the company that spent about almost $1 billion on R&D over the last 15, 20 years, have finally got a novel drug and $700 million upfront payment. So I hope that'll excite other people about doing so. And the third is, I would think the state needs to now create the right incentives for corporates to put more into R&D. So I think these two new, earlier the way it worked is ministries just gave out money for R&D either to institutions or to government labs. Right? And when was the last time a CSIR lab ever produced anything that was cutting edge that industry really used? Yeah, I can't think of any instance. So I think now the way this new ANRF, this Anusandhan Research Fund, National Research Fund, Foundation, and this new RDIF, the Research and Development Investment Fund, both of them, the principle is that they're going to be informed by the problems of industry. So even in ANRF, there's a new CEO firstly, Shiv Kumar, who comes from the private sector. He's worked at Microsoft and IBM, stuff like that. Quite a dynamic guy. And they're building a cadre of people with expertise in different areas who will all be private sector. That recruitment is underway. And then the way they work on it, like they piloted with an EV challenge where basically they first convened industry and they said, what is something that you want solved in the next 5 years, right? And basis that, then a challenge grant was created. And initially it's 90-10, 90% from government, 10% from industry or partnership. And you then as a company now, Bajaj Auto needs to partner with IIT Chennai or Madras or whatever, and Ather needs to partner with so-and-so. And you create this proposal and you submit it. It's like a challenge, right? And then you'll be given money on that basis. And there's an expert panel that will evaluate these things. So this is the new mode in which they're going to do. The existing ministries don't want to give up their budgets. So unfortunately, that will stay. But this is the new mode. And hopefully, there's one ministry that's already come and approached the ANRF to run the challenge grant for them. So I think that's a good sign. That's a new way of doing this. And this RDIF, basically, idea is India has no deep tech ecosystem. All the VCs are doing, B2C brands or whatever, or e-commerce, this, that, which is fine. And I know Piyush Goyal got into a lot of trouble for making some insidious remarks. But I think what you need to do is sort of what like Yozma did in Israel, which is for the state, and the government did it with this SIDBI fund of funds to create more funds in private equity and investing. So now the idea of RDIF is basically to create a fund of funds that will then give you money. So you say, I want to raise a 500 crore biotech fund, agency empaneled by government, SIDBI or whoever, will say, I'll give you 250 crore. You've got to go raise the other 250 crore so that there's a market test, right? And now you can be up and running with your fund. This RDIF will also create more IIT Madras type research parks, which has been fairly high ROI investment. Yeah. And it will also give money to large corporates to go make acquisitions of IP and work on cutting edge research. So the idea is to provide, as opposed to just a tax deduction. Earlier India had this R&D policy where you got a 200% tax deduction for R&D investment. Yeah. The only thing that happened was not greater R&D, was just creative accounting. So I think now there's a different way of doing it. We'll see how it works out. But I'm more positive that I think these two structures are better structures than what we had earlier. And then some things like, in the space sector, they created InSpace, Pavan Goenka, private sector guys there. They've opened up the facilities. They've got a 1,000 crore startup fund. So I think that kind of stuff is what we need more of to get R&D ecosystem going as well.
Ashish, your life's been so inspiring, and I think the insights and the data points that you've shared are obviously very illuminating. One question for the diaspora. There's about 35 million plus Indian diaspora outside. What would your message be to organizations like TAI, people like us outside? What can we do to sort of contribute in this reform journey towards the path of Viksit Bharat?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it enough, but I would say that there's 3-4 ways probably. I mean, one is to contribute capital. I think so there's already Indians send a lot of money back, but I think Indians outside have excess capital, and so they can contribute. And of course, the Hong Kong Chinese did that well, and back into the mainland and things like that. So the second is, I think, business connections. If you have a business, I know a lot of NRIs have found it difficult to do business in India, but I think India is changing now, and I think that doing business there, or bringing companies, doing joint ventures, because you're outside, there's clearly an opportunity there, and you're a better place to do it than an Indian who sits in India. So I think that's another way to contribute. And a third, which I think Indians already do, is sort of build general goodwill for the country, which, I think India has a reasonably good reputation globally, thanks to the diaspora.
The soft power aspect of it.
I think it's, soft power, or even just generally being perceived as a country that's a positive player on the global stage, and one whose diaspora adds value to whichever society it goes into, and is a stable society and a stable economy, and that kind of stuff, which I think is a good signal to the outside world, particularly if it wants to invest in India or get involved in India.
All right. One final question, a personal one, before I open it up. You've done private equity, philanthropic equity. What next for Ashish Dhawan? Finally itching to get into politics, something you said you wouldn't 10 years ago. Is the time now?
No, I have simpler aspirations. I would love to be a bartender on the beach as a next career. So.
All right. I'm going to open it up for questions. So if anyone has a few, I'm sure you have questions, so that if you could just pass the mic around. Anupam? Oh, there's only one mic. So Anupam, here you go.
Ashish, so nice to hear from you always. I think you know what I'm going to ask about. But I'm passionate about the role of places in achieving people's potential, and I just wanted your reflections on the role of cities in terms of how it correlates to GDP. Does it correlate to GDP? I don't know if you've thought about that. And you did mention that there's, in the context of education, of course, and that was a really interesting insight about Finland and Singapore not being the right model. So where should India, if at all, should it learn from within? Should it learn from somewhere else? And is there any reflection in that context on the Singapore-India relationship and future?
Yeah, so firstly, I think cities play a super important role. I think that India has 50 growth hubs, which will drive the economic growth of the country and will be the place where the labor markets are most vibrant. So not only do you create net jobs, but also productivity is much higher in those places. I think that we've not invested enough in urban. So even though the government has increased capital expenditure, now, up to almost 3% of GDP by the center, another 3% from states. So it's reasonably good for infrastructure, but a lot of it from the center goes, rail and road are the two major programs. Urban is a poor cousin, and urban gets money in sort of dribs and drabs, right? And we know, look at a city like Bombay, where once you start to do many things at once, you build the metro system, you build a coastal road network, you build a new airport, you build a bridge connecting to the new airport. You can transform a city in 5-10 years if all that comes together. And it's already a vibrant place in terms of energy, and once you have Bombay now has an economic plan, which a guy who we partnered with, Shirish Shanke, who left McKinsey, worked on with Niti Aayog, and then Fadnavis has adopted it, which is basically the problem with Indian cities. One is, if I asked you even what's the GDP of Surat, nobody will know. So nobody even has that, because the GDP gets measured firstly at state level. Even district estimates of GDP are not so good, and cities are not exactly mapped to districts. What does the labor market look like in a city? Most people wouldn't have any idea what the labor market, What's the core competence of that city? What's the labor market look like? So we've not really paid attention. What investment does that city need? Which are the binding from a public investment, government investment? And then how will that city go and attract private investment? Because private investment should be 10x the public investment. Public investment just to create the basic infrastructure, the enabling conditions, etc., in order to attract. And for that, you need, a governance mechanism or some mechanism to go and attract that. I mean, we are in Ashoka, we are in an education city, the Rajiv Gandhi Education City in Haryana. So I remember we met the Chief Minister of Haryana. This is back in 2009. We bought this in 2010 or 2008. And he said, we have this new education city. We bought 2,000 acres of land. This is going to be the new North Campus because Delhi has no space, so this is going to be. And if you look now, 15, 16 years later, out of the 2,000 acres, they have allotted less than 250 acres to educational institutions, out of which Ashoka is the largest at almost 100 acres. 2 of the institutions haven't even touched the ground that they started on, which are smaller plots. And one is IIT Delhi's research campus, which has 50 acres where there's hardly any students and hardly any activity. This is 15 years later, because there's nobody there to market this thing, to go and figure out what realistically should be the land price, how will I attract these in. Whereas Dubai, which had nothing, when I go to the UAE, there's a guy there whose job is to go, he's busy reaching out to Ashoka. And I'm like, we don't have the capability nor the will to go and locate there. But they're going and selling, they have a piece of land, they've built student residences, they've got the connectivity, and they created an education city out of thin air. And they don't even have a real student population to be served. So I think that in urban, we also need this idea of creating these, like in Bombay now, they have 15 projects. And to the Maharashtra CM's credit, 5 education institutions are coming to their new Edu City near Navi Mumbai, whereas the Haryana government has taken 16 years to get 5 institutions into the Rajiv Gandhi Education City. So I think on urban, it's not just the money, but the governance mechanism, how you crowd in the private investment, and really creating an economic plan for each of these 50 growth hubs in India. The Bombay one is very good. There's one now being created for Vizag because Chandrababu Naidu is a dynamic CM, and what he did with Hyderabad, now he wants to do there. There's one that's being created for Surat as well, and one for Greater Varanasi. These are the first 4. But there's a great demand. I think the good thing is government has now woken up realizing that these are growth hubs and they want these. How it will be acted upon, time will tell. With regards to learning from others, Singapore, Finland, I didn't mean to be, to look down. I just think you have to be careful in terms of what you learn. So I think Singapore and India, there's a great partnership. I think obviously lots of capital invested through Temasek and GIC. There are some companies, Singapore Inc. companies that operate in India, good companies like Capital Land and many others, Keppel Group, all of that. Singapore Telecom through Airtel. But I think that Singapore in certain areas can really help India, like, in technical education, vocational, like, when we are building a semiconductor ecosystem in India to build the manpower capability or the technical capability around that. There's something to be learned from Singapore. So I think there are specific areas where we can definitely, get technical inputs from Singapore as well.
Right? Yes.
I don't need a mic. So just wanted to get your views. We talk of investment in India. India is essentially a services economy. Right? 80 billion FDI, most of it in services, very few in manufacturing. On the other hand, there is PLI, which the government is making a lot of effort to attract investment in sensitive industries. So how do you see this? The manufacturing investment, domestic and foreign, is not very high, apart from iPhones, which is assembly work mostly. There's PLI on the other hand, and there's services. So how do we put these together? There are some industries which are geopolitically very critical, but our core strength is in services, not so much in deep research. Any thoughts you'd like to share on how this evolved?
Yeah, so see, I don't think it's an either or. For a large country like India, if we were a small state, we could say our core competence is one small thing, and that's it. You live on the back of that. If you're Ireland, you can offer tax breaks to companies and live off of that, you know. I'm being a little facetious, and some tourism, and or Singapore, you can do your one or two things that are. But I think if you're a large country like India, you need multiple engines to fire. And different parts of India also need different things to happen. Much like China. China didn't say, we're only going to go after labor-intensive manufacturing. You know, it did do a good job with labor-intensive manufacturing, but it also moved up the value chain in terms of, you know, advanced manufacturing. It did focus on, you know, some very good service sectors, even within China. So I think a country like India, we can't say our core competence is services, and that's all we'll do. And by the way, most services we don't do very well either. They're very low product. No, they're very, like retail, productivity in Indian retail is very low. So it's not like, you just think of services because you think of IT services or that. So I think you develop core competencies. You're not born with core competencies. In a large country, you have to develop those core competencies. It's not like China had a core competence in semiconductor manufacturing. It's not doing advanced, but it developed that over a period of time. Japan wasn't born with an auto industry. It developed that auto. The Koreans fought hard to then climb up and become major players. So I think the same thing with India. And by the way, I'm not only for manufacturing. I think even the service sector, you need certain industrial policy for the service sector and certain incentives and the state needs to play that role of being the coordinator, facilitator, incentive provider for certain service sectors as well if we want to excel in those sectors. So it's not either or in my mind.
I can speak for me. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us. It's refreshing to see a man of your intellect and vision taking the lead in some of these sectors. You alluded to it during your speech that there were barriers and walls that protected the industry that made them super profitable. We are one of those who benefited from that when we did a joint venture in India with Tatas, which was very, very profitable. But I think the biggest fear the world has around India is the same fear that India has, is when are you going to open up? And if it does even more, when will it take place and how will it take place?
I think it's going to happen soon. I mean, whatever we finally settle on with the US, it's going to be lower tariff barriers in India for sure. And you've already seen the FTA we signed with the UK. Earlier, the auto lobby was so strong, wasn't willing to bring, and there was always the argument we needed protection, and maybe we needed it for some period of time. So I think it's the world will force us to lower our tariff barriers. You know, in this room I can say it, but Trump is not wrong when he says India is the tariff king. There's some grain of truth to that, you know. So it's unfortunately the vested interests in India are so strong. It's not just going to happen on its own. I think you need some external pressure to make it happen. So I think it's around the corner because we will sign an FTA with the EU. From what I hear, even with the US, it was sort of agreed almost. So we're not far away. Once there's a climb down, I think we will reach some settlement with the US, and it'll mean lower tariff in India. Now, there are non-tariff barriers also, like QCOs and other things. Even that, by the way, is being relooked at now. And the reason it's being relooked at is, so I can understand strategically, look, every country has used these tools strategically. We had no toy sector in India. It's completely hollowed out by China, right? And now what they did is they used the QCO, Quality Control Order, as a way to give the toy sector a chance to compete. And now you've got a toy sector that's come up in India finally after a long time. There's domestic, they're actually exporting, small amount, but not. And so using these tools strategically is important. The problem is we used it as a blunt instrument. So for instance, we have QCOs on inputs. Now I think it's doing a huge disservice. For instance, if you have QCO on steel, many special grades of steel are inputs into export. It makes you uncompetitive. Or we have a QCO on polyester and VSF. For reasons because there are businesses in India that thrive those sectors. But those are essential ingredients for man-made garments, synthetic garments. So I think it's not just about tariff, it's also non-tariff barriers one needs to look at. Use these tools as strategically, not as blunt instruments. But in aggregate, I think the walls will come down.
Ashish, this is Narendra on this side here. I've had the opportunity of listening to you on some of your earlier visits and also benefited from the connection I made to AIP. And in fact, Aditi from your office was very helpful in one of the schools that I help with in India. My question is around education and particularly around English, that for us to be successful in India, the fluency with English is almost a given, and whether it is manufacturing, services, anything. So since you have so much experience on the education side as well, do you think that we should be going hammer and tongs after it to teach people English, or do you think we should go the other way around and say English is not so important? You can be successful with your mother tongue, or I don't know what else.
See, I'm both pragmatic and also, I would think, evidence-based. So the evidence is very clear that L1, which is the first language you learn when you get to school, should be your mother tongue. Because for humans, oral language comes naturally. You know, nobody needs to teach us how to listen and speak. You just learn it through osmosis in the home, right? But reading and writing is an artificial act. It's like connecting that letter sound connection, and it's hard. And you go to school, and your parents teach you, and so it's common sense that if you already have the oral language, say in Uttar Pradesh you're growing up and it's Hindi, then you better get literate first in Hindi. So in the early grades, your L1, your first language, should be Hindi. And all research shows that you're more likely to get literate faster. And by the way, you learn L2 much faster if you've attained literacy in L1. So you're much more likely to do very well in English later if you've got one language under your belt. So I think in India, we shouldn't displace we should keep L1 as the mother tongue or the state language, because in a state that like Madhya Pradesh, you'll have many tribal languages as well, other languages. So that also is an additional complication where you need to transition people from home language to state, which is a dialect often, to state language, but it's more similar than transitioning to English. And then you start English. Even these kids in school, you can have English as a second language, but prioritize the state language first is my belief, because that's what evidence shows. Now the pragmatic side of me says is we should double down on English further as you get into middle school and high school, even more. And there, unfortunately, we do Naam ke Vaste English, which is we say, yes, I've seen many states that say I'll have these English medium schools, or I'll move to English, but the teachers can't even speak English properly and they don't do it well. But yeah, so I would say it should be grounded in the mother tongue, and then later you can.
We have time for two more questions. Ashish has a flight to catch, and I'm sure you guys would like to network. Okay, maybe Vijay and then Ajay.
Ashish, sorry, I'll speak now. Oh.
Thank you. Firstly, very insightful session. Really enjoyed it. My question to you is, I agree with you that, in a country that's as huge as India, with as much diversity of people, culture, and problems, we have to take multiple approaches to make it work. So do you think one stream that is maybe missing in the Indian context is taking a private equity or an impact investing approach from the government. Many people keep talking about how India should set up a sovereign wealth fund, and it does have the NIIF, which is not very big, and it is kind of limited in its scope. But a lot of people talk about, SWFs being set up. Should India consider setting up an impact fund, and which can also allocate, some funds to each state, which also ensures that, two things happen. One is, of course, the grants anyway are ongoing. But in addition to that, if they can have some investments which are actually investments, but which are more patient capital, do you think that approach will work?
So, firstly, you only set up a sovereign wealth fund if you run a trade surplus and a capital surplus with the rest of the world. I mean, the Middle East accumulated capital selling oil, East Asia accumulates capital selling manufactured goods. India has a capital deficit. Most years it runs, even today, a current account deficit. So I don't think we're in a position to set up a sovereign wealth fund, right? So that shouldn't be our aspiration. Having said that, should we provide some capital to states so that they can in turn seed private equity type structures? I think that's a good thing. That doesn't have to be through a sovereign wealth fund. And I think that private equity as it exists is already a vibrant ecosystem. I don't think the Indian government needs to do anything other than whatever little issues they have, just making sure you don't have stupid transfer price issues and other issues that you put people on, angel tax on angel investors and stupid things like that. So I think just make the rules of the game clear, and markets will work. The LPs, whether they come from abroad, and over time you'll get more LPs from India. The markets are working. Same thing with venture capital. You need to stimulate deep tech because it doesn't exist today, so that for sure. And you also need to stimulate a different kind of SME investment fund. See, all the startup guys are still working in the fancy startup ecosystem because they want the non-linear bets, right, is the bets they're making. They're not going to Meerut and saying, there's a business there that's got, 20 crore revenue. How do I work with this guy to get him to 100 crore revenue, right? And what I think India needs is, apart from the deep tech, is those funds.
But till the private sector actually does that, it's hard to convince a PE fund or a VC fund to go to Meerut.
You don't need to convince a PE fund or VC fund. I need to again find, because I'm not going to convince my old firm, Chris Capital, to go. They're busy doing larger deals, and whoever out of Meerut lands in Delhi with 1,000 crore business, they'll look at that. They're not going to bother going to Meerut. So what you instead need is an ecosystem. There's enough smart people in India who've got basic finance, banking, some invest. You tell the person, listen, if you go set up this fund focused on hinterland India, smaller ticket size, working with SMEs, I will give you half the capital, the other half at a subsidized, even I'll be second preference capital, or I'll give you an instrument where, I give you debt, but it's debt that you only pay back contingent on delivering X% IRR to your LPs. Now you go to family offices, others, you raise the rest of the money. You don't need a mega fund. Now you need a 200 crore fund, a 300 or 500 crore fund. And those guys are the ones who should then go make these bets across the hinterland. So if I were Uttar Pradesh, I would go and stimulate these 20 little funds for 10 little funds for Uttar Pradesh that's investing across the top 20 cities in Uttar Pradesh, finding that business that's starting to break out, and take them and work with them and take them to the next level. So this will also be a kind of investor, if you're working for Warburg Pincus, you're not going to do this because your carry and your salary is so high, you're not going to bother doing this. So this will be more Ghati private equity, And I think that's the way we should do it, if you ask me, because that's missing. Just that capital doesn't exist today.
Ajay? Yeah. Final question.
Hi, very insightful session. Thank you. So my question is, you mentioned about the education, and it's a pretty complex, function wherein the outcomes are dependent on a lot of things. And also it is dependent upon the environment in which, society is operating. And for us as a country, it's a unique set of, the factors that we kind of deal with. So in this context, I wanted to ask your opinion. In a lot of other countries, for example, in America or in Russia, Israel, or maybe to a little extent in Singapore also, there is a lot of horizontal movement between academics and government and private players. And that happens in, multiple directions and with a lot of flexibility. So has something been tried on that front by you or your team or maybe somewhere? And what are your views on that? Because that will kind of, give a lot of exposure and complementarity in terms of the skill set that, each player brings and the kind of unique perspective that is needed to kind of solve our problems. Thanks.
Yeah, so look, I think this idea of whether it's private sector going into government, that happens elsewhere. It doesn't happen that much in India. And there was a lot of resistance even to this lateral movement, and the Prime Minister then backed down. And I think it's a good thing, but you also have to be careful. I think in America, it's led to regulatory capture also. When you have a revolving door between private sector and especially regulators, you have a lot of regulatory capture by private business as well. So one has to do it, but do it carefully. But there are lots of other constraints in India, pushback from the bureaucracy itself, etc., which is above my pay grade. I think so instead the state has used things like fellowships and other ways to get younger people engaged with, or hire them as consultants in Niti Aayog for 3-year term, junior positions, not senior roles. So that's a much more sort of structural administrative reform and the bureaucracy in government. In terms of academia, I think that, in government institutions and all, we just need to create the right incentives for them. So even in the US or elsewhere, I think it's 5% of academics who then are somewhat entrepreneurial and want to go create their own enterprise or take their IP if they're a scientist and do something with it, or partner with someone to go. And partly because they're allowed to own equity, they have the upside, they have that freedom. So I think the best we can do is, free people up a bit, allow them to get a consulting salary income, allow them to get equity in these businesses, and then maybe even give them. I was at NUS today, and they have for researchers programs on, telling them how they can commercialize IP. We don't have that kind of stuff in India. So I think you can do that, create the incentives, and then it's up to the researcher whether they want to partner with someone to commercialize what they have or not.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this formal conversation. Ashish, you've been a pioneer on so many fronts. Thank you so much for spending time with us in Singapore and just illuminating us and leaving us so optimistic about the path ahead. Yes, a lot of challenges to be surmounted, but I think you walk the talk, and I think you leave us inspired to sort of do our bit. Hopefully, as citizens here or permanent residents, like you said, there's a lot that we can bring to the table as well. But thank you so much for your insights. Thank you for spending time with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Ashish, Dhawan.